My mouth does not work today. Hello everybody, welcome to Wonky, Encore. I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And, it's time for something new on this channel. I'm ranking all the Jean-Michel Jarre albums from worst to best. Okay, I guess this is not a new idea by any stretch. The reason I haven't tried to make videos in this format is because for a long time I considered it more ARTV's thing. Even if he's not the first to the idea either, they're still undoubtedly my favorite videos of his. But since then, so many other reviewers, including the Melon himself, have just gone ahead and done it anyway, and done worst to best lists themselves, so what the hell, may as well implement the format myself as well. And what better artist to debut the format here like the prolific pioneer of electronic music we've talked about so much on this channel already in the past couple of months. Probably the last thing I'll ever have on the topic of this man until he releases his next album, which, I don't know, might not be for a while and it might actually be way sooner than I think, but yeah, you never know with him. I'd actually hoped to do this video in place of the top 10 tracks, since I think the discussion on his albums is a lot more interesting than discussion on individual tracks of his. But he decided to announce Equinox Infinity right as I was about to try and start work on it, so I just did the top 10 anyway. But I did promise this video was coming, and now here we are. Since I've already reviewed every single one of these albums, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details. Maybe mention some reasoning why an album is higher or lower than another, but I'll try to keep it as quick as I can, especially since there's 20 albums to go through. I'm only counting his main studio albums, no live albums, no compilations, and I also decided to take out music for supermarkets as well, because the fact that it is unfinished demos from Zuluk and Rendezvous on it leads to me never putting it on, and I also hate the AM radio rip, even if fans have remade it and made it not sound like ass. And the whole one copy existing thing doesn't really feel right putting it into the ranking. But let's not waste any more time. Disclaimers, this ranking is just my opinion based on my own personal preference at the time of recording this video. This is not the be-all and end-all, and your personal ranking could be completely different. Also, the numerical ratings I gave in the main reviews do not play into my ranking. It just is what it is. So, let's get into it! This is Jean-Michel Jarre, worst to best. At number 20, we have Interior Music.
You look great. You look great.
So we're starting with this bizarre anomaly in the Jarre catalog. I've always preferred Jarre albums that do something different over ones that adhere to his usual sound and formula, but this is one experiment I just really can't sign off on. It's a total misguided mess. Two ambient pieces, one that covers itself in weird voice samples that are way more distracting than they are relaxing, and one that removes the voices but otherwise just scrolls through a bunch of okay ideas but never allows any enough to develop enough to become compelling or memorable. It's certainly an interesting album and still probably worth one listen for curiosity's sake, but this one's just a head scratcher that I have no urge to ever return to. At number 19, we have Les Granges Brûlées. I'll admit Jarre probably didn't have the budget to make this stuff sound decent yet at this point, but this pre-Oxygen sound is really hard to listen to, and the samey compositions adhering to repetitive motifs because film soundtrack make it even more of a drag despite the short length. It's not inexcusably bad or anything, and it has some cool ideas. This doesn't leave me asking Jarre what the hell he was thinking, like Interior Music does. I get exactly what he was doing here, and it's probably fine for what it is, but I just really don't enjoy listening to it much at all. At number 18, we have Chronology. Whoops, I imagine I have this ranked much lower than most people are going to have it. I mean, this album at least delivers on Jarre's core appeal, unlike the previous two. I enjoy it enough to have on my iPod and put some tracks on every now and then. Like, Chronology 2 is one of my favorite tracks of his purely out of context, and higher ranked albums don't have individual tracks I hold up that highly, but the general lack of new or interesting ideas and just overall feel of a rehash, as well as the embarrassing and heavily dated 90s jock jam noises in certain parts, really drag this one down, and I very rarely feel compelled to put it on in its entirety. The people who just want Jarre being Jarre probably got their fill, but I like Jarre more when he steps out of his comfort zone, and this just doesn't really do it for me personally. At number 17, we have Deserted Palace. Like Le Grange Brûlé, the production on this one is outright terrible, thanks to lack of budget. But I think the ideas that went into this album were at least fun and unique and offer enough variety to still be a rewarding listening experience. Its creativity puts it just a hair above chronology for me, though its crappy shoestring budget production prevents it from rising any higher. If these ideas were given the proper care and refreshing sound design Jarre could deliver later on, I'd probably like it a lot more, but, you know, I still like it. At number 16, we have Geometry of Love. I do have to give this album credit for not adhering to the typical Jarre formulas and being a solid chill-out album with some jazz elements and really solid and well-balanced production, but it's still quite low on the list as there are stock loops I've used in my own music that are super distracting for me personally, and generally, this is pretty bland by the standards of this genre. There's so much better chill-out out there than this album can deliver. It's not great by any stretch, but it definitely has its moments that I enjoy a lot. And I'd be lying if I said I never feel compelled to put it on every once in a blue moon. It's still a nice listen. At number 15, we have Magnetic Fields. Yeah, I'll admit this is another one that's probably unusually low, and most people will have it higher up. But it's really not one of his strongest releases for me. It's a bit of a mess that doesn't come together as a whole very well, and doesn't have any of my personal all-time favorite tracks of his. I really don't put it on often. But it's still pretty iconic, I will say. Anytime tracks from here come up in a comp like Arrow or a live album, it's always fun. If I were including live albums in here, the Concerts in China delivers everything here, and also plenty of other material that's sometimes even better. If I were counting that, it'd definitely be higher up. This album by itself, though, it's got some great moments, but it's never been a huge personal favorite, honestly. At number 14, we have Tio and Tia. Oh boy, I think I'm gonna piss some people off by having this album up this high. And it's really not that high. I'll admit this album is a bit of a mixed bag. It shows Jarre trying to pander to the EDM crowd at the time. I will understand if this is nothing but cringe to some people. And yeah, there are definitely tracks like Beautiful Agony and Melancholic Rodeo that are in fact really hard for me to listen to as well. But I'm going to still stand by my stance that it's really not that bad. With some exceptions, I think it does really well for what it is. The EDM stuff like the title track is still solid in spite of its cheesiness, and there's some excellent tracks like Touch to Remember and Partners in Crime that I really love, and just keep me coming back to this thing. And it even kind of works together as a whole concept. If Jarre wasn't the one who made it, I can't imagine this would have gotten the same level of hate. I'm still gonna defend it even if it's on the lower half of this list. At number 13, we have Equinox Infinity. It's the new one! Yeah, it's not incredible, I'll admit. I thought there were some callbacks to the original Equinox that were way too obvious for my tastes, and it doesn't have any tracks that are likely to stick with me in the long term, but I love its structure and pacing. I love the production. It's probably a more satisfying front-to-back listen than Tio and Tia, and has no truly cringeworthy moments. As an album experience, this is really tight and well constructed, and I gotta give it credit for that. Now, if you include those weird fade-outs between tracks on Spotify, this album would drop way down to right below chronology. I know Jarre wanted to minimize the pop you get with buffering pauses between tracks, but he didn't fully get rid of it, and is just incredibly irritating being the lover of continuous mixes that I am. I'd prefer the pop, quite frankly. But it is an ignorable offense since this is just a streaming exclusive thing. For the album experience, if not the track-to-track one, I'll give it my thumbs up. I mean, it's really close to Tio and Tia enjoyment-wise, they're pretty much equal, but for now I'll just barely give this the edge for being easier to defend. At number 12, we have Electronica 2, The Heart of Noise. There is little to nothing bringing Electronica 2 together as a whole, besides the whole every track is a collab concept the project had. And there are some definite low points, such as the disappointing Orb and Hans Zimmer collabs, the bizarrely cheesy Primal Scream non-collab, and the dragging downer of the Yellow collab. And aside from the incredible exit with Edward Snowden, there's not much in the way of soaring high points either. But the vast majority of these tracks are still really solid. There's lots of great new wave collabs like with Pet Shop Boys and Gary Newman, weirder, more intriguing moments like the Jeff Mills collab and the Peaches collab, which sounds nothing like anything Jarre's ever done. It opens in a super epic way with the two-parter Roan collab as well. While undoubtedly a mixed bag, and one that gets noticeably less interesting in the second half, there's easily enough good material and unique flavor for me to sign off on it. It's a good album. At number 11, we have Revolutions. Speaking of mixed bags, oh boy, doesn't get more uneven than Revolutions. The high points on this album are absolutely incredible. The Industrial Revolution suite is behind only Oxygen 4 as my favorite thing that Jarre's ever done. And there are other really fun tracks like the title track and Computer Weekend which keep me coming in repeatedly, but there's also the painfully generic London Kid, the overblown closer The Emigrant, and the well-intentioned but personally really irritating September. I don't know. It's among the most conflicting albums he's ever made, and it ends up right in the very middle of this ranking. If I were including music for supermarkets, it would in fact be the exact midpoint. I can't think of a more fitting spot for this album than that. Whoops. At number 10, we have Rendezvous. Alright, here's another album of pure Jarre being Jarre. It's not very out of the box or original by his standards, pretty safe album for him, and as such is also near the middle of this ranking. But Rendezvous still has a sound all on its own that I can specifically attribute just to it. It's an album that just capitalizes on the titanic hugeness that the 80s has, and more than any other album, it makes Jarre really feel like a real superstar. The high points aren't even close to Revolution's high points, besides maybe the final track, but that requires knowing the full story behind its creation to deliver the strongest impact. But it also doesn't have any low points either. It's just really solid front to back, and a pretty big career definer as well. The bigness of this album is something that Jarre would keep trying to recapture many times since, with varying degrees of success as seen with previous entrants here. Still very good album here, and very important part of the Jarre story. At number 9, we have Waiting for Cousteau. This is similarly one I'm a bit conflicted on. The Calypso suite that opens up the album is okay, but in no way his best work. Only fits on the album as I'm told Calypso was actually the name of Jacques Cousteau's ship, and sonically doesn't really gel well next to the title track. It's not enough of a low point to sink it below Revolutions, but awkward enough to not float it any higher. But goddamn, that title track is one of the most beautiful ambient pieces I've ever heard. 46 minutes long with little to no progression, and I never get sick of it. That piece alone gets this album in the top half of this ranking. I absolutely love it. As a whole, while there are certainly better albums he has than this, Waiting for Cousteau is out of the box enough for him to stick out more to me than Rendezvous, and easily consistently enjoyable enough to recommend to pretty much everyone. It's a very good album. At number 8, we have Electronica 1, The Time Machine. Now, this is a great freaking album. Much better than Electronica 2 in my opinion. Well, it still has some pretty big low points. The Laurie Anderson and M83 collabs are meh. And Pete Townsend saying "move your feet to the beat" gets more and more cringeworthy every time I even think about it. But there's so many fantastic moments from this thing that have really continued to stick with me. The Air collab probably most of all, being the giant Air fan that I am. But the Lang Lang collab is a super cathartic and beautiful closer. The Armin collab is maybe the best work Armin's ever done. The Vince Clarke collab gets better every time I hear it, especially the second part. And there's so many other really fun tracks, like the collabs with Fuck Buttons, Robert Del Naja, and Moby, and heck, even if the Little Boots collab is cheesy as hell, I still really enjoy it for what it is. As a whole, while still not very cohesive or consistent, I think there's a lot more value to be found here than Electronica 2, and the best moments have cemented themselves as among the best Jarres ever done. At number 7, we have Sessions 2000. Jarre does jazz. Why not? I know this is really not an album for everyone and barely sounds like something he'd do at all, but I have always been a sucker for this kind of jazzy, chill-out lounge stuff, and while some synth tones can be on a bit on the obvious MIDI side, I love this album not only for how relaxing and satisfying a listen it is, but also for how much of a strange, out-of-the-box move it is for Jarre, playing very little to his usual strengths, but still coming out really enjoyable. Albums like this are why I've always preferred Jarre more when he tries new things, and this one just so happens to play really heavily in my personal taste. Still love this album. At number 6, we have Oxygen 3. I'm aware there is no shortage of vitriol for this particular project, but this is unquestionably my favorite Jarre album from this decade, and one that lives up to the legacy of the original. It is pretty obtuse in the way it relates to the original, but the album covers us more than you'd think. While much more modernized, this album captures the simultaneously dramatic and chill spirit that the original had, and recontextualizes it to its own unique experience that still sounds futuristic, hell, even more so now, and still exemplifies itself as a Jarre album that only Jarre could possibly make. It's basically the modern reboot of the original, except, you know, actually done really well, unlike most modern reboot movies. Some people say it's just a generic Jarre album with not enough relation to the original. I can get that perspective, but I really like the fact that I actually had to think about it and pay attention to the details to get the most out of it. It's a really compelling idea that I think was executed really well. At number 5, we have Equinox. Ah yes, Equinox. While totally a rehash of Oxygen that basically delivers nothing sonically that the original didn't already, it really says something that this album is pretty much equally well remembered, to the point of Jarre also making a direct sequel/reboot just like he did with Oxygen. In fact, a lot of people have told me they consider this album to even be an improvement on Oxygen. And though I personally disagree, I think it's perfectly valid to say that, because Equinox is still excellent. The melodies and rhythms are still super iconic and super memorable, and have held up so well over such a long time. Most artists, when directly rehashing the thing that got them big, come up short, but Jarre managed to almost perfectly make the exact same magic happen a second time. And it has so many of my favorite tracks he's ever made, especially parts 3 through 7. And, speaking of rehashes that make the magic happen a second time, at number 4, we have Oxygen 713. I know that I said I prefer the Jarre that tries new things over the one who just rehashes his old ideas, but hell, making a direct sequel to his classic that so well embodies what made the original work and convincingly fits in the same package, despite being released over 20 years later, is not something I think any other artist has really done before. At least not this well. He did the direct sequel and the modern reboot and pulled them off better than pretty much any artists I've ever seen try. No one has messed so much with the legacy of a classic album and perfectly gotten away with it every single time, besides Jean-Michel Jarre. At number 3, we have Metamorphoses. Anyways, back to Jarre albums that try new things, and I fucking love this album so much. There are so many interesting and creative ideas all over it, with so much variety but still staying perfectly cohesive in the framing of Jarre entering the new millennium and looking ahead to the future as always, and the sound design and production is so incredibly jaw-droppingly good from start to finish. Sure, the lyrics that Jarre often implements into the album are at best mediocre and at worst outright laughable. See, I can see in your eyes so many guys, so many guys. But the album's production is so ridiculously good that even the cringiest lyrics are excusable. Even if it's not your thing, I stand by this very well being the most underrated project in the whole Jarre catalog. And speaking of sound and ideas transcending inherent ridiculousness, whoosh, at number 2, we have Zuluk. Zuluk is not Jarre's most serious album or the easiest to get enveloped in the atmosphere of everything. It's an album that sounds absolutely ridiculous in many parts, bleeding 80s everywhere with all its Seinfeldy bass lines, cheesy pop, voice samples that sound like they're saying dirty words. I don't care if they're not actually, they still sound like that to me. But Zuluk isn't a success in spite of its occasional ridiculous qualities like Metamorphoses was. Zuluk fully embraced these qualities. Its silliness is part of its identity, and only helps make the cheesier moments like Zulukology all the more fun and enjoyable. And perhaps more importantly, Zuluk, to this day, is not an album that sounds like any other album out there. The way he utilized voice samples in the early days of sampling was super forward-thinking and creative. I mean, there have been albums that utilize sampling or world music influences in similar ways to this one, but there's still no album out there that sounds quite like Zuluk. It's a wholly unique experience that no one's even really tried to recapture, and I love every second of it. But as much of a masterpiece as I consider Zuluk to be, if it wasn't already obvious from everything I've ever said about Jean-Michel Jarre, at number 1 we have Oxygen. What can I say? It couldn't have been anything else. It's a classic in pretty much every sense. Jean-Michel Jarre's entire career has been defined by this one album, which completely changed the game in 1976 and blew everyone's minds, and even 40 years later still sounds fresh. And it's an album that, in spite of being so hugely influential and having left such a lasting mark on the genre, you can't even replicate a single tone or texture from this album without directly reminding me of Jarre. This obviously wasn't the album that made me want to make this video. I mean, everything that came since and the incredible story that followed the man are what spurred this on. Jarre is not a one-album wonder, but this is the album that started it all. And it is still the Jarre album I get the most enjoyment out of listening to. Even disregarding historical context, it's one that made a big mark on my own life just as it did for the entire genre. And I'm just saying a whole bunch of stuff I've already said plenty of times before, so I'll just leave it at that. So that's my ranking of Jean-Michel Jarre albums from worst to best. I may do some of these lists for other artists I've done discography reviews of later on, but not all of them. For instance, I'm probably not going to do Aphex Twin because a different reviewer called The Sound Binge already did it, and she probably tackled it better than I would have. Only difference is that if I made it, I'd have 8592 at the top. Check that video out, by the way. And I also want to keep this with artists that have back catalogs of at least 5 albums. My rankings of, for instance, Daft Punk and Boards of Canada would not make for all that interesting videos, even if they'd be really easy clickbait opportunities. Well, Daft Punk, maybe, I don't know, but BOC, that'd be a really boring one. It'd be pretty easy to guess what I'd say from the reviews I've already done. But stuff like Air or the Chemical Brothers would be fun to do, so maybe those will be some things to look forward to in the future. But, yeah, of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. If you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But, yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.